Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thrilled to be with you on this beautiful Friday. We are still reading Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, considered by many her most important book, at least many more of the more theoretical aspects of her readers. It is in many ways the book in which a lot of the rigorous distinctions that she makes that are so important to her work get worked out. It's not the book on totalitarianism, which is grounded in a real factual historical event. It's not the book on revolution, which compares the American and French revolutions. It's not the book on Eichmann about a trial. It's a book that's about the human condition. It's much more, a little bit more abstract and yet also deeply relevant to our world and who we are. And so we're going to continue to try and read it together to understand why Arendt thinks it is necessary to think what we are doing, right? That's what she says she's doing in this book, to think what we are doing. Not to say good or bad. And I think that's something that needs to keep being remembered. It may be a weakness, it may be her strength. But this is a book that explicitly imagines itself as simply an effort to think, what is happening? What is it that we are doing? And that means she thinks we're doing something. She thinks we are in the process of doing something that will change the human condition, not human nature, as we talked about a few weeks ago, but the human condition, the world that we share, the way in which we are conditioned in being born into that world. And that's changing. And, Arendt, as you all know, I think if there's anything we know about her is she's a thinker of the new. And so the fact that the human condition is changing is not necessarily a bad thing. It's something that's happening and we need to think about it. And what do we do when we think about it? That's an excellent question. And we should think about that question of what we do when we think about what we are doing. But in part, in thinking about it, we will respond differently and we will thoughtfully respond to the changes in the human condition that we are doing. That's what this book is about. It's a spur to thinking about what we are doing so that we will do it more thoughtfully and less thoughtlessly. And that's Arendt's approach. We are in the middle of chapter 1 of the book, which is called The Public and Private Realm. And within that chapter, we're in sections 6 and 7, which section 6 is on the social, the rise of the social, and chapter 7 is on the public or the common realm. Chapter 6, section 6 on the rise of the social is one of the most fraught, challenged, difficult, and potentially wrong chapters in all of Arendt's work. Hannah Pitkin, who was one of my first teachers of Hannah Arendt, and a great scholar of Hannah Arendt, and a great scholar on her own right, wrote a book about 25 years ago called The Attack of the Blob. And the attack of the blob, yes, I did say wrong, John. It's a complicated chapter and we're going to get into it. But the attack of the blob is a metaphor. The blob is a metaphor for the social. The social is, in Pitkin's rendering, the negative of all the positives that Arendt imagines in the human condition. So if as we've talked about many times in this group, what is really driving Hannah Arendt? Well, freedom, plurality, meaningfulness, right? Okay, we could come up with other terms: newness, action, starting something new, spontaneity. The social is everything against that. The social is, instead of freedom, it's behavior or conformity. Instead of plurality, it's singularity. It's the oneness of society, that everyone shares the same opinion. And instead of meaningfulness, it's a kind of almost invisible. And a meaningfulness is when we act and speak in public, and thus we matter. People pay attention to us. The social is where we disappear into a blob, in Hannah Pitkin's word, into the oneness of the social. In the opening paragraph of Pitkin's book, she says her book, The Attack of the Blog, traces the career of one problematic concept in the thought of one major political theorist of our time. One problematic concept, the social, in Hannah Arendt. The concept, the social, merits attention not because the theorist got it right and used it to teach an important truth, but quite the contrary, because the concept was confused and her way of deploying it radically at odds with her most central and valuable teaching. If studying it is nevertheless worthwhile, that is because its significance transcends the technicalities of textual interpretation and the critique of a particular thinker's work. If the concept was a mistake, that mistake was not just idiosyncratic or careless, and the problem that the concept was intended to address remains problematic. Now, I'm not saying that Pitkin's right and the Arendt's concept of the social is wrong. I think that it's an open question. But I do think Pitkin is right to say that the concept of the social is absolutely integral to Arendt's work and thinking. As the challenge, it represents what it is in our world that Arendt finds dangerous in what we are doing. And it's what happens in our world that takes us away from the plurality, freedom, and meaningfulness that she yearns for. That doesn't mean the social is what we should get rid of. We can't. I mean, Arendt is not someone who's saying we're going back to a world pre-social. That's not her point. But she does want us to be aware of the way the social is potentially dangerous and limiting. And so this chapter on the social is quite important as this negative idea. It's called The Rise of the Social, right? And let's start there. The social is something that Arendt thinks is particularly new or modern, at least in its power. In its power. We just read last week the chapters on the public and the private, the household and the polis, and in those chapters, Arendt says that for the Greeks there was the public and the private. The social was largely not there. And so where does this social come from? Well, she says that it comes from a change in the value of the private. The Greeks thought the private as idiotic, idion, and thus something that was negative. Private, in the very word you hear, privation and absence. And in the modern era, privacy has turned into something which she calls intimacy. Intimacy as that whole internal world of what we think and share in our heart, that we share in poetry and music. And this personal intimacy, she says, is no longer a private that is opposed to the public, but is an intimate world that gains its credibility from what she calls the social. What is the social? Um, the social is sort of the world of society, the opinions that everybody shares. Um, and it's against this sort of oppressive society. I mean, I don't think anyone I know has been a teenager and not felt the oppression of society, which makes them have to be, enter into the world in a certain way and conform to certain behaviors. And, teenagers therefore love to write their poetry and think of themselves as different and unique. And this is the rebellion, not against the state, but a rebellion against society. And the thinker here that she embraces or thinks embraces this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's a thinker we often call Jean-Jacques, who is a thinker of the intimate realm. She talks about how in the modern era, in the 19th century, we have a flowering of poetry and music. There's the rise of the novel. And what is the novel? She calls it the most social art form, which is concerned with one particular person who must find him or herself against a world of conformity. It's the flowering of an individual against society. And at the same time, we see the loss of public arts, namely architecture. Insofar as today we have architecture, even public architecture, it's intimate. It's not seeking to create or embody a public and lasting world. So think of some of our most famous memorials, right? The Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., or the new 9/11 Memorial in New York, or the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. These are memorials where you don't have, a memorial to some great public ideal. You have a memorial to loss and a kind of interiority, and you're supposed to meditate as you walk through them. And they're very powerful, but they are intimate, not public, in Arendt's words. And she says that this intimate rebellion directed against the leveling demand of the social on page 39, this intimate rebellion is a rebellion against this leveling demand. And where does this leveling demand come from? Well, it's not from one person. It's not from the paterfamilias as ruled the private. It's from society, the mass society. Well, where does that come from? Well, she has a number of answers. One is economics. So economics is the study of interests, supply and demand, and self-interest. And that self-interest, according to Adam Smith, is what drives all human activity. The utilitarians said the interest of man is to maximize pleasure. And so what these economists and social scientists imagine is that all men, all people have a single interest, and that interest leads to common opinion, and it leads to a kind of rational understanding of society, which has its end in bureaucracy, the most social form of government. A government designed by bureaus, not individuals, in which the bureaus and en masse as a group think as according to a common social interest, so that we end up with what she calls the rule by nobody, which is not no rule. It may be the cruelest and most tyrannical form of rule, because it's a rule you can't oppose. There's no person who's imposing it. It's ruled by a kind of societal reason. Such a society in which we're ruled by bureaucracy and normalcy and reason is dangerous, because it leads to what she calls the exclusion of action in lieu of behavior on page 40. She then goes into a fascinating, from my point of view, fascinating account of statistics and economics. So let's just think about a few of the things that she talks about here. So first of all, she says that mass society, right? Society emerges when society and the social embraces everyone. The point is that even all members, the best and the elite, as well as the lower members of society, all the classes. And so what you see is the rise of things like chain stores. Even the luxury brands are now chain stores, right? There's even the elite sort of live in a world of what is common and are dominated by advertising that sets common interests. Higher education is now something that is available and dreamed of for all, for the masses as well. And so equality becomes the highest value and achievement of modern society. And this equality means that society, this sort of leveling equality, conquers the public realm and everything. Again, she's just asking what we are doing and what's happening. In this event, what she says is that a new kind of equality emerges. It's not an equality that belongs, as we talked about last week, to the few who have others working for them and therefore can enter the public realm as equals, as peers, but it's a modern equality based in a kind of conformism, economics, and social science. It's the social is dominated by a world of statistics, and this is again one of her other insights that I find incredibly meaningful. Statistics, as a rule, are only valid when you have large numbers of people. It depends on the assumption, she says on page 42, that deeds and events are rare occurrences in everyday life. What does that mean? It means that if people act freely and spontaneously, then statistics aren't going to tell us very much about the world, because they may say that this is what, X number of people are doing, but people will change how they act. Statistics are only meaningful when people stop acting in ways that are rare and new and free. And so she says, meaningfulness in the world, right? The fact that we appear and people talk about us and we matter only comes about in rare deeds, when we act freely. And in an age of statistics, according to the law of large numbers, even people who do act freely, because there's always going to be some, get pushed to the side as aberrations or statistical abnormalities or anomalies, and we end up with a mass normal society, such that we actually lose. We actually think that the people who do things that are different and new and shocking and surprising are not great. They're not the humans. They're actually sort of the crazies, the aberrants. And so we end up with what she calls the obliteration of politics and history, the obliteration of rare deeds, and we rule out of importance as meaningful everything that is not everyday behavior or automatic trends. This is all on page 42. The idea is that the larger the polis or the state, the more it will be run by bureaucracy, statistics, and social behavior rather than political action. This is not, she says, this is what's happening, right? Think what we are doing. She does say she thinks it's dangerous, right? Dangerous in what sense? She says that the danger, the unfortunate truth about behaviorism on page 43 and the validity of its laws. So the unfortunate truth about behaviorism and the validity of its laws is that the more people there are, the more likely they are to behave and the less likely to tolerate non-behavior. And what is more, statistical uniformity, non-behavior, is by no means a harmless scientific ideal. It is the no longer secret political ideal of a society which, entirely submerged in the routine of everyday living, is at peace with the scientific outlook in its very existence. Statistical uniformity is dangerous because it's at peace with us ceasing to act. We want to achieve peace. We want the world to be scientific. We want the bureaucracy to work. We want to be told what to do by experts. We want to be perfected. Above all, we want to be comfortable, secure, and safe. Recall the prologue. We want to escape the human condition. We want to get to this place where we live in this happy, we have things to eat, we have games, we have entertainment, we're taken care of, and we don't have to risk anything. And this is what she calls the victory of society, the rule of nobody over our individuality. There's a fascinating discussion about how this is actually deeply imbued both in Adam Smith and in Karl Marx's work. Smith, insofar as the idea of the invisible hand is the one interest of society, and Marx, insofar as his idea of the one true interest of administration and the withering away of the state, and the idea that there is a common interest or a communist interest or a social interest in society, is for her the root of this rise of the social. The result is that life, our concern with security, life, and comfort replaces action in politics in the public realm. And this, she says, it results in the possibility on page 46 that mass society, where man as a social animal reigns supreme, and where apparently the survival of the species could be guaranteed on a worldwide scale, can at the same time threaten humanity with extinction. Humanity here in the sense of humanity as an acting and free and meaningful being. So that's sort of the negative, right? The social that we were talking about, the blob, as I mentioned earlier, sort of what Arendt sees as the obstacles to her dream of freedom and meaningfulness and plurality. The next chapter, chapter 7, is, I think, somewhat more familiar to those of you who've read Arendt, but it is to some degree a reflection of one part of her dream, the public realm or the common in its ideal form. And she begins chapter 7 by saying she actually has there are two meanings of the public. On the one hand, the public is everything that appears in public in a way that can be seen and heard by everyone. So the public is the space of appearance. The fact that we live in a world in which me and you and all of us can appear and be seen. We appear and be seen when we act. That's when we're free. And thus, when we freely act, people will talk about us, and we have the potential to be meaningful. That's one aspect of the public. The other aspect of the public is that the public is actually the world itself in which we appear, but it's also the world itself, that is common to us all, that we create. It's the computers and the papers and the mouse and the pens and the churches and all the things we create. And when we enter this world as a world, there are these things that we talk about, whether it's Picasso's or sculptures or an art or a poem or an inauguration, the things we share. And it's this world that lies between us we who share it in common. And she says, as a table is located between those who sit around it. And these things, this public in this sense, is the world of the in-between that relates and separates men at the same time. And both those are important. It relates, it brings us together, it gathers us into a common, but it also separates us as unique, as plural, as different, as not the same. And both of these are going to be absolutely essential for her understanding of the public realm. I think there's, to some degree, I think this is a chapter that's a little more clear than the first. So I spent some more time on chapter 6 on the social. A few things she would say. In the public realm, it's where we appear. It's not what's internal. It's not our inside. What's in our heart is worldless and shadowy. Thus, pain is a truly borderline experience between being among men and death. Pain is not something that can be shared in the public realm. It's separated from the private realm, right? We've talked about that. There's things that belong in the private realm, like love and charming little things, entertainment. The public realm is the realm that we gather in, that gathers us together. And she talks again about this idea of the table, right? One of my favorite metaphors in Arendt, many of you have heard it before. If we sit around a table, even though we're all different, we gather to some degree as a group. If the table disappears, suddenly we're just individuals sitting there, not held together by anything, unrelated to one another. And that, she says, so that the public realm in that sense, in the second sense, is like that table, that the in-between that holds us together. The worry she has is that we are living in a world of worldlessness, where the very faith that people had, or the hope that people had, that this public realm, this common world was there and that it would last, has dissipated. And the problem for our world, she says, is how do we live together in public, in common, freely appear before each other, and thus be meaningful in a world, in a worldless world. The danger, of course, is that we turn to consumption and enjoyment, because if we don't believe that the world's going to last, if we don't have this faith that we're going to live into the future, and that we also contain a past that we bring forward, we just consume and enjoy that world. How do we unite ourselves? One example, she says, is Christian charity. And so she thinks that will no longer do it in the modern world. What we need, or what we lack, if you want to put it in the negative, we lack transcendence. We lack a view that we live out there in a world that lasts from the past into the present, into the future. And she says on page 55, again, one of, I think, the most important lines in her work, without this transcendence into a potential earthly immortality, no politics, strictly speaking, no common world, and no public realm is possible. The common world is what we enter when we are born and when we leave when we die. It transcends our lifespan. It's there when we're born, and it's still there when we die. But without transcendence, without the idea that it is something that will last, the common world disappears. It is what we have in common with those who came before us. It is what we share with those who come after us. Such a common world can only transcend when it appears in public. And she says that throughout history, men entered the public to enter the common world, to enter a world that transcends, to be political, and thus to have something of them, because they're part of that common world, last beyond their lives. And that's what immortality is. And the problem today, or the fact today, the thing we're doing today, is that we have an almost complete loss of the authentic concern with immortality. So to seek immortality is now a vice, namely vanity. And no longer is politics or the polis a path to immortality. Yes, of course, there are poems and books and songs and artworks that are popular and revered, but they are increasingly content, something to be monetized that will, that we need ever more content. I mean, you look at what's going on right now during the pandemic, the need for constant new shows on Netflix or Hulu or whatever it is you watch. Things don't last. They're to be consumed and spit out. And we are drowning in content. And that's what she means by the loss of a kind of transcendent world. I'll end with this, that in our world of the loss of the public and of transcendence and of immortality, we lose, she says, the reality of the public realm. And here's the key point. This is on page 57. The reality of the public realm, which relies on the simultaneous presence of innumerable perspectives in which the common world presents itself. We can only have a common world, sit around a table, a world of people around things, when we all see and hear from different positions and different perspectives, when there's a multitude of spectators. You actually need difference and uniqueness to have a common world and a worldly reality. Because if you don't, you end up with simply a oneness, the sameness, the mass. And the mass actually destroys what is common, because it levels it down and makes it not transcend and thus not worthy of lasting. And this happens, she says, in one sense under tyranny, when we're all sort of stuck in our private rooms and lonely and isolated. But it can also happen under conditions of mass society or mass hysteria, where we see all people suddenly behave, not act, but behave as though they were members of one family. In that case, we all become entirely private or intimate, and we retreat into our own little bubbles, our own little worlds, and we're imprisoned, she says, in the subjectivity of our own singular experience, even if it's the singular experience of a mass experience. And under that pressure of one perspective is how the common world ends. So, again, these are just two chapters in the middle of this section on the public and private in the book, The Human Condition, but they go together, right? The social is that mass, that leveling down, that hinders the continued existence of a transcendent public sphere in which we can act and be meaningful and be free. And so, we're getting into this book, The Human Condition. We're still in chapter 1, but starting to set up some of these distinctions that will matter. All right. So I'll stop there. I'll remind us of a few things. One is, if you have questions, please raise your hands. You can also have a dialogue in the chat. I won't have a chance to look at that. I just am too busy answering questions and engaging, but you can. But if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand, and we're going to go in order of hands raised in the chat. And I'm going to try and keep to that. If there's a real emergency and you want to comment on something, let me know. But I'm going to try and keep to that order. And let's see if we can make some sense of these very difficult chapters, but interesting chapters. Susan, you're starting.
Yeah, I'm still very confused.
Hold on, I can't hear you. I got to turn my volume up. 1 second. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm quite confused about how creating a common world is considered the project that we should be doing. And at the same time, this world that's social is detrimental and creating the opposite. So I don't know how we can get together and create this common world without being social.
Okay. We last week we talked about chapter 4 or section 4 of the book, where she said, man, a social or a political animal. Remember that? Um, and to some degree, what she wants to say there is that a political animal, a bios politicos, is one who's concerned with what is common, whereas a social animal is concerned with society, with a one opinion or oneness. So when she says that we, again, it's not that we shouldn't be social. She's not saying that. But what she's saying is, to the extent that we are social, we are not being political, and we're also not being common, because common, okay, and here's a good point, right? Important point. The common does not just mean a large group, right? It doesn't mean a bunch of people who all agree. The common for Arendt is the public, the space of appearance, where you can appear. And to appear, Susan, you have to be different. Because if you're the same as everyone else, you're not going to appear to them. You're going to meld into the background. And so without difference and uniqueness and plurality, there is no commonness. And so insofar as the social, again, I want to repeat what I said at the beginning, right? She's making distinctions. Do these distinctions always work? Do these distinctions, are they absolute? Absolutely not. They are distinctions that are supposed to help us see and think about our world. They're not supposed to become, rigid categories that we think that sort of make us, crazy. This, to be social for her, means to conform to a kind of leveled mass ideology or normalcy. And thus it is to lose our individuality and our uniqueness and not appear in a public realm, and thus a common realm. I hope that helps. Does that help? Okay. Nancy.
Yeah, I had a couple things. One, on previous chapter on page 32, she makes this strong distinction between equality in the polis and hierarchy or an inequality in the oikos, in the household. And I wondered if, just thinking about the Greek polis, which she's talking about, whether the fact of it being there's institutionalized inequality as to who is a citizen, who's included in the polis. And I wondered if this related to some extent to Bill's objections, Bill T. Jones's objections, I know Bill's on, to considering, let's say, the American experiment as a place where freedom and equality and all sorts of good qualities can be praised, but institutionally from the start, there's inequality. So it seemed to me that maybe each time you talk about the polis as a place for equality, you need to qualify that from the start, because institutionally it was set up to exclude women, slaves, and
and foreigners and children.
Yeah.
No, absolutely, Nancy. I mean, this is not, as someone once said, this is not polis envy. She's not sitting here saying the Greeks were great and, we suck. Her appeal to the Greeks is not because they had it right. It's because in Greek society, there was a different idea than our society that shows some things that she finds valuable and other things that she found abhorrent.
Mhm.
And so, what we see in the Greek polis is a kind of equality amongst equals based on a prior pre-political inequality, which is deeply violent.
Mhm.
And she is making us aware of that, and raising a question of, can you have the kind of equality that the Greeks had, which has a kind of freedom and meaningfulness to it, when you now live in a world, thankfully, of more and more, never enough, but more and more social or private and pre-political equality. And she's raising that issue. She is, I think she does believe that there is something beautiful and human about the kind of freedom and meaningfulness that the very few Greeks who could attain it had.
Mhm.
I think the dream would be that we could bring that to everybody.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, if she believes that's possible.
Mhm.
I don't know. I think it's probably, my guess would be to believe that she thinks it's not.
Mhm.
But that's, I think, the dream
Mhm.
in some way.
Mhm.
Um, so she's after that.
Mhm.
What she's doing in now talking about the rise of the social is talking about the way in which that dream is being eroded for everybody,
Mhm.
insofar as the social applies to everyone,
Mhm.
high and low, masses and elite,
Mhm.
and freedom, whether for the few or the many, is being uh uh eviscerated
Mhm.
in our world.
Mhm.
um so I think that's what she's after in these sections.
Mhm. Okay.
Okay. Nick.
Yes, hi, thank you. Uh, I wanted to ask and invite folks and ask you, especially Roger, how uh, Arendt might view what is going on today, how our human condition is today in the sense of the social,
Hold on,
in the
Nick,
social media.
1 second. Someone, can you mute yourself if that's your phone or
Yeah,
something?
it's my phone. Sorry. Let me
Oh, that's
just.
you. All right. um all right.
I'm sorry about that. Very bad timing. Sorry.
Yeah,
Uh, so my, so my question is, can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you.
Hello?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay. Uh, so my question is, in the social today, the social media, there is statistics going on, like parts of what Arendt says, but there's also like big data today. In the sense, I saw a documentary where in the social media, we are the product, and the customer is the advertisers. So by knowing if you buy product A, most likely you want product B and C. If you have idea A, then most likely you would be prone and you would have idea B and C as well. So they know this all about us, and in that way they can manipulate us. So I'm wondering how Arendt would read this situation. In the one way, one would say this is awful, we're being manipulated. In another way, one would say that, well, this is efficiency because now we, as consumers, we're being guided to things that are of interest to us, that will be helpful to us. is one way of looking at it. And therefore, the social media is in fact doing a service. In the same way that now our ideas, we're able to meet people with the same ideas, and therefore we're able to communicate and get closer to one another, but at the same time, it produces silos. And this is where we have this, instead of the one perspective, we now have really multiple perspectives in the condition because we have, in that sense, even multiple and alternate realities for each silo. So this is the thing that I'm seeing. Maybe it's not the thing that maybe Arendt is saying or is predicting. It seems like it's a little different. The one thing, and the second thing on the social, I would like to wonder. I'm wondering if the social is a natural consequence of our striving for equality. This agonistic view that Arendt kind of is pointing to in the old Greek was built a lot because there were an elite. It included slavery. Now that we eliminate slavery and we're striving for equality, then in that sense, for all of us, for most of us, life is the greatest good. I mean, what society brings, which is the a focus on life itself, is appropriate for most of us because we are now somewhat more equal, and life is survival is of importance for many of us, and so I'm wondering if this way is very natural and actually good because the agonistic way is the way we've had it from the past, and that leads to me when what is the best is what we should be striving for and to be better than others, that also has led to strife and war and conflict. Whereas this way, with life being the greatest good, equality is actually something that helps all of us and not just the elite. So these are the two different things I'd like to ask in terms of how would she think about these things and would she revise her views?
I got it. No, I don't think she'd revise it. I think you're very much right on target in many ways. To start with your second question, because maybe it's more basic. From her point of view, the social and equality don't have to go together, and yet do, because, as you rightly put it, Nick, equality today means something different than it used to. Equality today means a kind of peace, a kind of everyone's kept alive, everyone is sort of on an even keel, and it means efficiency, and it means convenience, and it means security. But it could also, what her view is, equality doesn't have to mean that. Equality could mean action, the equal right to act and die and be part of strife and war and conflict. Her view is that if to be human is to be meaningful and to be free, then you can't be meaningful and free if you live a kind of safe, efficient, convenient, secure life. You can be happy, but you can't be meaningful. And so this comes down to what I said a couple weeks ago, or whenever I said it, that meaningfulness is in many ways sort of the core of Arendt's thought. She thinks that, while animals maybe don't care about being meaningful, they want to be happy and alive and whatever. She thinks that for humans, there's something more than happiness. There's freedom. There's meaningfulness. And she believes that, the rise of the social is not just about equality, but it's about the change in the nature of quality to a kind of leveling equality. On the social media front, and the fact that we are the product, I think you're right. We have become the product because instead of because we're basically I'm sorry, can someone turn their phone off? It's just very hard
Sorry.
for me to think that those phones are ringing. Um, we I'm sorry. In a social media world, you know, it's all about advertising. It's about, we give our data. There's not even a person who then says, oh, here's Roger Berkowitz's data. Here's what he, you know, is interested in. Let me think what would be interesting for him to get. It's from data to data. We have algorithms that move us from data to data. I wrote something about this on Amor Mundi last week about this Princeton lab, which is using computers to go from data about the world to data about the world without any theory or any human. It's pure data-based prediction. It's trying to take all humanity out of it. And that view is the we are the product view. It's just that we're data. We give our data. The data tells us, you know, what we want. It feeds us back to us, and we want it, and it feeds us more data, and we become leveled down to a kind of efficient, convenient, happy animal. That's the vision. Is it wrong? No. Arendt says, I think what she says is it's a radical transformation of the human condition. Humanity has been understood as something that was meaningful. And now humanity is changing into something that is secure, happy, and comfortable. And that's a change. And she says we should think what we are doing. Clara?
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to go to page 54, Professor Roger, second paragraph. And I would like if you could go deeper in the political phenomenon of wordlessness. Thank you.
Okay. She writes, I'll just read a little of it so we're all on the same page. Worldlessness as a political phenomena is possible only on the assumption that the world will not last. So just on that. So I said before that the common world is based on transcendence into a potential earthly immortality, and that no politics or no common world is and no public realm is possible without this transcendence. Worldlessness, the loss of the common world, can only be based on the fact that we're only in a now, that there's no transcendence over time. And so the world will not last. And on this assumption, it is almost inevitable that worldlessness in one form or another will begin to dominate our political scene. She says this happened after the fall of Rome. It happened, and it seems to be happening again in our day. The Christian abstention from worldly things, right? So the move away from the worldly to the eternal, is by no means the only conclusion one can draw from the conviction that the human artifice is as mortal as its maker. So if you think that we're living in a world that's mortal and it's not going to last, you could, with the Christians, move to the city of God. But she says this, on the contrary, may also intensify the enjoyment and consumption of the things of the world. And so instead of moving to the world of God, the city of God, the worldlessness can actually turn us not to God, but to Netflix and McDonald's and things that we want to consume on a regular basis. And that turn to the things of this world that we consume is not worldly, it's worldless, because it's all about the now and about consuming things without any attempt to transcend into a that pulls from the past or builds to the future. The paragraph ends, if the world is to contain a public space, it cannot be erected for one generation and planned for the living only. And, I think all of us can see, how can you not see this right today? If the fact that we can't get our hands around global warming is just one example of this. We can't, we live in this faith that somehow it'll work out, but we're going to live for the now and we'll let the others deal with it when it comes to it. That's worldlessness in her understanding.
Thank you.
Yep. I'm sorry. Is this Alexander? Alexander? I'm not sure if I'm getting that right. Alexander Depaltz?
Delpiez.
I'm sorry. Yes, Alexander Delpiez.
Oh, where did I go here? Hold on, did I just turn myself off?
No, I hear you.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
That section on page 57, where she writes, what you quoted already, the reality of the public realm relies on the simultaneous presence of innumerable perspectives and aspects in which the common world presents itself, and for which no common measurement or denominator can ever be devised. This is a very theoretical chapter, and whenever I read stuff like this, I'm always trying to look for examples in real life, in my real life, that kind of connect to it. And what somebody else mentioned, social media comes up as sort of a clear example of this society externalized, right? And social media has been faulted for a long time because it's sort of a sorting mechanism where people put themselves into silos. But I have an 11-year-old daughter, and I find something very interesting about what she does with social media, which is different than what older people do, which is sort of the opposite of sortition. I don't know if many people here are familiar with something like TikTok, which are these very brief, very random, asynchronous, in the case of TikTok, dancing clips, and that's what she spends so much of her time with her friends and with people she doesn't know, just kind of stewing in experience. And I don't say that because my daughter wastes her time, but because one of the things we deal with in our district here in school is a movement to try and expose the kids to diversity. And that in some ways falls under the social realm, where teachers work very hard to devise the categories and how they're going to talk about it and everything. And when us parents discuss it, we always say that our kids, through something like TikTok, are exposed to 100 times and 100 times the breadth of diversity that the system in school will ever arrive at. So I just wanted to comment that line in her work to me appears very real, even in the life of my 11-year-old daughter. So that's all. Comment.
Thank you. Far be it from me to burst any bubble about the beneficial nature of social media. Because I think it's neither good or bad on its own. I think that there's a distinction to be made between sociality, diversity, and plurality. I think that, social media, the way people use it, can bring us in connection with people all over the world. And as your child is experiencing it as well, people, dancing in who knows where, Bangladesh and Zambia and the United States. And that's a kind of diversity, and it's and it matters. But to the extent it is an encounter amongst people who, in Arendt's words, are largely under the same interest, whether it's enjoyment or fun or commerce or self-interest. It actually is not building a world in which we appear as individuals. We appear as once amongst many who are doing the same thing. That's her reading of it. And I have to admit, I find her reading on this somewhat compelling. And so for her, a common world, one that will last and one that aspires to be meaningful, has to be one in which the people we encounter as really from different perspectives, not, just different people in different places doing the same things. I think there's a debate to be had with her on this. I don't think she's 100% right, maybe. Obviously people in another country, in another culture, are going to come to TikTok with different beats and different, cultural references. But I guess, so I think that in one way there's a difference and a plurality, but I also think they come with the same interest. And I'm skeptical about whether what's created is unique and lasting material. In fact, I would say almost by definition, what's created on those sites is consumable and disposable. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not someone who spends a lot of time on them, so I can't say that I have 100% confidence in what I'm saying. But that's my I guess that's my intuition about them. I don't know if you want to respond to that, Alexander.
Yeah, I was thinking while you were talking. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. It's completely disposable, but there is something interesting about someone young being able to experience that sort of oceanic feeling, their first taste of it. I recall, so maybe relatedly, I recall an interview that with Bono from U2. It was a little throwaway interview, but it was on MTV, I think. And they asked him, how do you define pop music? And he gave kind of a very deep answer, simple, but he said, well, it's capable of belonging to the people. And it's sort of that opposite idea. If I'm writing a novel for myself, I'm trying to create, pop culture, which is throwaway. Some portion of it is people trying to create something that anybody else can take on as their own. And so it's almost like the universal solvent, which has a very interesting role to play. So that's what I would say.
I think you're right. And I think the oceanic feeling is precisely where I get lost in the meaninglessness of myself in the universe. I mean, it's nice that you put that in the Freudian words. I think it is a universal solvent. And what Arendt is saying is that what this universal solvent is dissolving is freedom, spontaneity, meaningfulness, and thus humanity, as it's been understood. Does that mean that it's dissolving the human nature? Absolutely not, because it may be that we create a new human nature in this new world. And she says, look, that's what we're doing. I mean, I think that's the bite of this book. We are in the process of creating a new human nature, a new human condition, right? And that new human condition is going to be different. It's not going to be one based in freedom and spontaneity and meaningfulness. It's going to be based in comfort and behavior and joy and consumption. And what she's saying is they're both human, but they're different. And we should do so. If we're going to change the way that we've been for 2,000 years, we should do it thoughtfully, not thoughtlessly. That's what she's asking.
Roger, may I say something about this matter?
Briefly, yeah.
Yes. I was thinking about TikTok and this kind of social media, And last year in Peru, there were the biggest movement of protest because we have a change in our government. And what we say, what people say here is that young people was very involved in this movement. And political people say that this was organized from the traditional political parties. But younger people say, no, we are organized by ourselves through TikTok, through this social media. So this was very interesting because it was like they engage with public things, engage with our political life. Very young people that we thought that they didn't care about it, and they use these kind of tools to organize themselves and go to the streets and protest.
Yeah.
And this movement was very big. So I was thinking about that. Maybe these kind of tools that are supposed to be consumable and disposable, maybe they have an outcome that they had the people who create these things didn't thought about, and people is using them in different ways. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk about it.
Thanks, Carmen. It's a good point. And, I think there's been a lot of people who've looked to Facebook or Twitter or TikTok and said, people through in Iran and Peru and elsewhere. And by the way, Donald Trump used Facebook and Twitter masterfully, right? As did his followers. And so there's been people who've turned to these platforms and said, actually, they're political. They can be used. I think there's a couple things to push back on that. One is that these medium generally are again not about creating a lasting common world amongst plurality, but are largely pushing one idea, right? So the left TikTok pushes one idea, the right Facebook pushes another idea. They're good for propaganda. Not sure they're good for encountering a world in all its perspectives. They also generally, don't require a whole lot of courage, largely because you're often speaking to people you agree with, but also you're just putting things out there anonymously or not in the ether. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons why they've had some impact, but they haven't been very effective in creating real change. We could have debates about that, but I'm not trying to say that there's never any good or use coming from these things. That's actually not at all what I'm saying. What I think I'm trying to say is that for Arendt, they are part of a movement that's transforming the human condition. That's as far as I want to go. And in a particular direction, which she thinks will, has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage being it makes us happier and more comfortable and more efficient. And the disadvantage that we lose a kind of meaningfulness, immortality, freedom, and plurality. Again, at that point, Arendt stops and says, all I'm saying is think about what you want. Right? So Dina.
Hi. Page 46, as you mentioned, and it's even more so in the German on page 58, Arendt suggests that our membership in a species, a characteristic that we share with animals, is responsible for the rise of the social. So much so that it actually threatens the existence of mankind, the non-hyphenated mankind, Menschheit. And I was wondering, how does that square or not square with your thoughts about earth alienation as the loss of our primal animalistic nature? In other words, is there a conflict in terms of the so-called if we go back to the Bauer quote, the so-called Dionysian animalistic desire to be seen, to do great deeds, to speak great words in the public, and the animalistic side of us that is satisfied with the social.
Let me try. Let me just read a little bit of what you're saying so that I understand it. So one of the characteristics of privacy prior to the discovery of the intimate. This is what you're reading, right?
It's the first paragraph on 46.
Yeah.
The sentence beginning, it is because this oneness of mankind. And then it goes on, where man as a social animal rules supreme and where apparently the survival of the species could be guaranteed.
It's because this
can at the same time threaten humanity with extinction.
Yeah.
The German is even, she actually expands on that in the German. And makes it even clearer on page 58.
58?
Yeah.
Sorry. We're on 58?
On 58, it's a lengthy paragraph. It actually covers almost the entire page, but if you go sort of towards the middle of it.
Yeah, I see it. All right. Die Einheit des Menschengeschlechts keine Einbildung ist. Is that
yeah.
it?
Yeah. And then towards the end, she'll say.
Unerheblich mehr als eine neue wissenschaftliche Hypothesis, dass kommunistische Fiktion des Klassikers natürlich kaum kann die Massengesellschaft mit den Menschen als gesellschaftliches Lebewesen voll emanzipiert und so augenscheinlich Überleben des Menschengeschlechts in Welt zu garantieren. So is there anything different? Where do you see a difference between?
I mean, it's more emphasized in the German.
Okay, I'm just going to read it in English because it seems similar to me. It is because this oneness of mankind is not fantasy and not even merely a scientific hypothesis, as in the communist fiction of classical economics, that mass society where man as a social animal rules supreme and where apparently the survival of the species could be guaranteed on a worldwide scale can at the same time threaten humanity with extinction. Yeah, I mean,
because it in other words, because it reduces all plurality.
Yeah.
To the mere survival of the species.
And thus,
so I'm wondering what that
reduces freedom and meaningfulness. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I'm wondering whether that side of our animalistic nature, right, our participation as a species.
Yeah.
Whether that is how that squares with the Bauer quote, in the sense that you spoke in the first session of earth alienation as a loss of our primal animalistic nature. But it's this very same nature that urges us to be seen, that wants to be performing great deeds. Great worlds.
By earthliness, she means there are being subject to fate and fortune in a way that we can't artificially control our fate and fortune and our world. And so when she's talking here about the public realm, right, which is what this chapter is, the public and the common, or this is on the social, but when she's interested in a realm that we make through human artifice, not that is the world of the earth, that we are simply born into before there is artifice. So earth alienation is when we become so technologically competent in our ability to fabricate the world that we can not only fabricate things, we can fabricate the worlds, we can even fabricate ourselves. We lose our earthliness that we share with other non-rational beings, namely that we are subject to fate and fortune. That's different, right? Earth alienation from world alienation, which is what's sort of more being talked about here, which is an alienation from a world that we create, not not a word, not the earth that's there and before creation, alienation from a world that we create, and thus a return from the world into ourselves, into a kind of subjective, intimate, internal mass loneliness. So this is a different worry, right? The worry of earth alienation is a worry that we're losing something about our humanity, which is that we are in some way finite and not in control. And that's part of what it had meant to be human. And we're losing that. The worldlessness that she's talking about here is that we're losing our connection to a common world with other people, that we transcend into a kind of immortal and lasting world together. There are two different worries that are behind this book, earth alienation and world alienation, and they're related. They're not the same.
I think I understand it. Where I was going with this was the animalistic, so-called primal animalistic nature that you discussed based on the Baal quote, and this Dionysian, so-called Dionysian drive to do great things. How does that square with our participation in an animal species that yearns for the social, or is cause for the rise of the social?
Because if we become part of a species, we care only about our social or species being, we lose our animalistic urge to appear as unique, great individuals.
But our animalistic nature is the cause for both.
No, I don't think so. I mean, the cause for the turn back into our social is not an animal. I mean,
it wants to be. We want to be fed. We want to be safe. I mean,
okay, in that sense,
we share with animals. I mean, at least according to Arendt.
In that sense, yes, but not in the sense that she thinks. Yeah, I mean, so she doesn't think that we turn into the social simply because we want to be fed and safe, right? She thinks that, we were animals back in Greece and we didn't do this. We turn into the social, not because we are animals, but because we increasingly value a kind of we value something internal instead of a common immortal external. It's a good question, I think, actually, you're asking, Dina. What turns us toward the social? What turns us away from the world? She's gonna try and answer that question in the last chapter of the book, called The Vita Activa in the Modern Age, chapter 6. And she's going to tie it to the rise of science, which turns us away from the world by turning us away from the world and towards theories and ideas, and thus bringing us back inside of ourselves, and the return to an internal versus a public existence. And so it's not our animality that's going to lead us to become a species being. It's actually our rationality and our increasing scientific nature that's going to be behind it.
It's interesting because what she says, what turned us in Greece to the polis was the appearance of the polis, and that we were family and herd-like before. Before that became available. So it wasn't in our quote unquote nature at all. That's actually. Right.
She doesn't think our nature leads either way.
Exactly.
Right?
Except in 46, where she seems to suggest that our participation in a species seems to, at the same time, have this. There's this tension that it can also threaten our humanity.
It can, but we've been a member of species forever. It's not the fact that we're an animal member of a species that leads to this danger. it's something else. And as I said, the something else I believe, and she'll argue in the last chapter, is the rise of science. And so when we get there, we'll have to see it. But I think it's a great question you're asking. Is that all right?
Yeah, thank you.
I've tried.
Yeah.
Ayala.
Yeah. First of all, to address this question that was said, reiterated in different forms, that I think would be helpful to look at our human nature. And human nature, I regard as very, very flexible. It's a whole spectrum of dispositions or potentials. So it doesn't rule out the individual and unpredictable behaviors. But to look at it as a dialectics, and the dialectics are between our social nature and our individual nature. Both of them are our nature. We are born with a need to have an identity as we grow up because of our consciousness, and to know who we are, and to take care of our needs and our thoughts and our wants. And at the same time, we have this need for connecting, for being embraced and belonging, for love, for sex. So those created always the tension that we see in these dialectics, and they bring us to the best transcendence and to the worst regression. Both. So we saw one of the worst regression was something that Hannah Arendt was going through, was the formation of the Nazi movement. And the positive, of course, is our social organization that we can't live without. The transcendence is because social dynamics are not individual dynamics. So when there is a social aggregation, humans, the results of the group behavior would be different than if we measure the results of each individual behavior in that group. And it brings us, for example, how does society decide that we need to pay tax, income tax? Now, as individuals, I think most of us are trying to either omit or reduce or find exemptions. Doesn't like to pay tax, but as a committee, as a group, we have decided that we need to do that. It will work better for us as individuals too, to cooperate on some structure of tax. What I was going to say is about the TikTok and the social media is that in a way, I see some romanticizing of the past. And Hannah Arendt is the generation of my father, who also came from Germanic, Jewish background. And there was some kind of nostalgia to the past, which I don't know if was really better as far as the human and group behavior. Doesn't look like it, but was different. Yeah. And, right? And that TikTok and Facebook, what they allowed to happen, which was great, was to turn categories into groups, right? Categories of, let's say, Black people or Jewish people. A group is an aggregation of people who know each other and decide on things. Categories are just people who belong to, according to color, religion, or whatever, gender. But that way, it created groups. Although the groups are still virtual or digital, it's not the same as around the table as Roger brings it. But look at the worst of it, which is the formation of these right neo-Nazi groups now in the Proud Boys. But also it helped create the Arab Spring and Occupy at the time. So the fine line, and I think Arendt is referring to something without, I don't know, we use different words, is how we manage these dialectics, maintaining our critical thinking as individuals, not committing to a group because we want to belong, and yet at the same time connect with the world and use cooperation without which we can't survive.
Right. I think that's I think there's an argument to be made, right? That Arendt makes this, so she has this overarching distinction between public and private. And then she says this new thing emerges, the social, arises the social, right? And I think, if I understand what Ayala is saying is, you can say, look, okay, maybe I get it, maybe I don't. But, the rise of the social is just sort of the fact that, sometimes we focus more on the private and sometimes we focus more on the public. And that there's, and so, yeah, sometimes we disappear into a mass, and then sometimes we pop out and we become individuals again. And there's sort of a give and take and a dialectic, if you want to use that word. And I don't think that's 100% wrong at all. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, all of us sometimes fall into a mob, not in a bad, I mean, into a blob, or the attack of the blob, to use the Hannah Pitkin quote. No one can be an individual all the time. Arendt's view is that used to be that when you weren't an individual, you were back in the private and thus sort of protected, and you could be changing and unique. Whereas now, when you get out of the public, because you can't be an individual all the time, you're sort of stuck in this sameness and you don't have any chance to really grow. And I think Ayala can say, well, I think that's a bit much. There's still the private, there's, and you can move back and forth, and there's some sort of a dialectic. I don't disagree with that, and I don't think Arendt would disagree with that. Like I've tried to say over and over again, these are not, steel tight categories. What I think she's arguing, and again, I'm not saying she's 100% right, but I think it's important to understand what she's arguing, is that the space in our world to be in the public or to be in the private is shrinking, and the space in our world where we're stuck in this sort of blob-like social is growing. And it doesn't mean that there's no public, and that doesn't mean that there's no private. It's just that those are both in retreat, and the blob is taking over more and more of our time, our space, and our mental activity. And that as it does so, the opportunities for freedom and even for uniqueness diminish. A. B, even when people act in ways that are free and exciting and new, those acts have less and less impact on the world. It's, I think, one of the, it's harder and harder to impact the world. You can't, imagine, it used to be, I don't want to be nostalgic, but, if you want to impact the world today, you can't simply write something. You can't just make a movie. You got to shut down the highways, or then you got to storm the Capitol, or you got to, take over a police precinct. The point is, you have to do more and more and more to get noticed, because everything has been basically turned into, oh, that's a statistical aberration. If X number of people protest or if X number of people sign a letter, you know, we know what the numbers are, and the numbers are that 99% of the people think everything's okay. And so you have to act ever more radically in order to be noticed. That's part of her argument. And this, so that's all I can say. I mean, there's no doubt the dialectic exists. I just think she thinks that more and more we are controlled by and stuck in this blob.
Yeah, I don't see the dialectics as moving from one to the other.
Okay.
It's a tension, but as a tension. There
Yeah.
is a tension constantly of being individual while in the public place and in the group.
Yeah.
I mean,
And again,
it's how to keep your independent critical thinking while you are interchanging and sharing with other people. How to be an individual and a social at the same time.
okay. I'm just going to move on because we have time constraints. Lena.
Hello, hi, thank you for allowing me time. I think this, what I'm going to say relates a bit to what we were just talking about, because it's about how can we be radical. And as I was reading this section, I came across one part which really kind of disturbed me a bit, which was about love, and where she says that, and it's on pages 51 and 52, and she says, love in distinction from friendship is killed, or rather extinguished, the moment it is displayed in public.
Yeah.
Never seek to tell thy love that never told can be. Because of its inherent worldlessness, love can only become false and perverted when it is used for political purposes, such as the change or salvation of the world. Now, to me, this kind of really disturbed me, these lines, because obviously, you know, within feminist discourse, or to quote Bell Hooks, who says, love is an action, never simply a feeling. Or, for example, seeing an exhibition at the Barbican in London in 2018, which was Modern Couples, which was about various people who are various couples who are living differently and therefore exhibiting their love in a different way. I felt that was very much a political act as well. And in a way, it is one of those things that can really differentiate us, and that can be about plurality. If this is what we are seeking, a kind of a difference, that is the way how we love and how we engage with people. So my question is really, you know, from this position we are in, is it possible to mobilize love and joy in this public sphere, in political sphere? So that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. That's a good question. And you know, so part of this again is Arendt's terms. She has a very particular view of love. So for her, love is such a powerful and transformative feeling, I guess. I don't know exactly what to call it. That when two people are in love, the world disappears, right? That's her terms. And so love is worldless or anti-worldly. It takes two people and so wraps them up in each other, and they both become better or more, you know, whatever, through each other, but they leave the world. You know, and so love separates us from the world. Friendship, right, is as a worldly activity, because in friendship, I can care about you and seek to free you and help you, but I don't lose myself in you or you in me. she has arguments with a number of people about this throughout her life. One is James Baldwin, but Baldwin tries to in The Fire Next Time mobilize love as a political and important activity and feeling that drives and holds, in his case, African Americans together. Many Jewish thinkers did the same things with Jews, saying that Jews who were oppressed learned to mobilize love. And Arendt rebels against these claims and says that when love is used politically in this sense, it depoliticizes. It makes people, in a sense, care about each other, but they lose their political action and they lose their connection to the world. They become connected. They become, they become to almost love being oppressed, because that allows them to find this sort of closeness and nearness to each other, but it actually depoliticizes and de-worlds them. So your claim that with feminism, you can bring a kind of care for the other into the public world. I think the danger Arendt sees in that is that in speaking about caring for others, first of all, I don't think she thinks that as love, but it has a tendency to sort of trap oneself in darkness and care, and not in politics, not in engaging in a world and arguments about what's right and wrong and how we should change the situations of oppression. And so she actually thinks it can be counterproductive. Again, I think in seeing her distinctions, one can find sense in them, and one can also argue that she maybe goes too far. I don't know. But that's I think I hope that helps in at least explaining what she's trying to say here.
Yes, thank you. It does. I suppose it's the question of definition of love, because she does say in opposition to friendship. So those terms aren't quite defined, at least not yet in the book, precisely. Because I also very much appreciate this idea of being lost in love and being kind of outside of the world because of it, and it's kind of quite romantic and beautiful. But I guess it's also different kind of love that in my opinion does mobilize us towards political action, and being in social movements for me is very much about joy and love. So it was just a passage that kind of kind of disturbed me a bit, but thank you very much. Thank you.
So you might turn to friendship. Social movements for her are problematic insofar as they become social, and thus one loses oneself in a mass, and thus also are not worldly in her mind. But yes, friendship can be a very political activity for her. In fact, for her, the friendship may be the quintessential political activity. Vivian.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yep.
So I want to two things on the way to my question, which is about meaning. First of all, I think I personally think I read it as being entirely disingenuous, not to say normative, which for me is a bad thing, to minimize the fact that Arendt's not only importance to her of meaning, but that she wouldn't be writing if she weren't so utterly and completely, and all of this is about meaning. And I think that on the way to understanding this, you're very good, Roger, at explaining things, but yet you fall short a lot. It took you a long time when the whole TikTok discussion to actually say the word consumerism. One thing about consumerism, we consume highbrow as well as lowbrow, or lowbrow as well as highbrow. In your examples, don't just say McDonald's, say going to the opera. You know, it's the same. I mean, for me as a working artist, I am sickened by cultural consumption, but that's an aside. So I think that I wish it were more upfront, all the words that she uses, whether it's love, social, whatever, although you do discuss the meanings of these words, and you use the word distinctions a lot. There's this distinction between the public and the private and the this and that, yet you fall short. And what I mean by falling short is you don't actually spell out which, and if I'm wrong in thinking, in understanding this in Arendt, then I want to know this. You don't spell out that ordinary looking words never mean what they're not meaning, what we think they're meaning in common sense language. And whereas everybody here in the group might say, oh yes, yet several of the questions just sort of assume a common sense understanding of all the terms that they then ask about. So I want to come back to meaning, and it's pervasive in absolutely everything from what the social as opposed to the what is the opposite, the not the public sphere, or
the intimate.
Yeah, well, that you have to be in where you have to be in the public sphere to be heard. Now, again, what does this mean, to be heard? Also, this comes back to, by the way, a different thing, the comment that you just made about to be heard. You didn't say this exactly, but you'd have to, storm the Capitol or blow up a building to be heard. But in fact, you might write a book, you might actually make a film, but then to be heard, doesn't happen in the consequential or the sequential way, in which it has nothing to do with whoever made the book or the film. It has to do with context and consensus in the public sphere at some point where that book or that film might actually be able to change the world or how we see it. But to come back to being heard is what is that? Is it to make something lasting? I think that, and that's obviously one of the things. I think to think that Arendt is, or to say that Arendt is, she doesn't say this is good and she doesn't say this is bad. Those are the things that I find disingenuous, because everything that I see or read or think about Arendt shows me she has her values just like the rest of us, and they do actually mean things to her. So when she says, that something, in order for something made to be great, it has to last, these are ways in which she expresses what her preferences. She's not completely in a state of perfect equanimity where she thinks, as you said, well, we're only human, and if we descend into the blob for a minute, you said not in a bad way. How is descending into a blob not in a bad way? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. Yeah. And you see, so in terms of meaning and being heard, this must surely mean, and here I want to use a word that I'm sure she'd never use, because again, it's related to the word of consumption. This would be the word of achievement. To make something great or to achieve something great, is this what is being heard? What does this mean? Meaningfulness. So I don't know if my question makes sense.
Vivian, it makes perfect sense. Thanks for it. And and I think it's an important question. And one of the reasons I've been doing what you call disingenuous so earnestly, and in fact, genuinely, is because it's such an important question. And I've been trying to, you know, I guess, so first of all, Arendt, of course, has many strong opinions and prejudices. And I don't think she would have written this book or lived her life if she didn't deeply value freedom and meaningfulness and
Exactly.
one of the
Exactly.
reasons, okay, just let me answer,
Yeah.
one of the reasons, she has this alertness to the Greeks is because she found something deeply beautiful and meaningful in their way of life. I think I've said that many times. And so, yes, I think she's asking us to think what we are doing because she personally does not like a lot of what's happening. The brilliance of Hannah Arendt, right? And I mean this I find this aspect of Hannah Arendt's to be so extraordinary is her impartiality, her Homeric impartiality. She can basically, obviously, she comes at this with her prejudices, which I think are obvious if you read the book. But what she's impartial enough to say is, I might be wrong. And what I love about the world is that I'm not the only one in it. And I'm not the person telling people what's right and wrong. But what I can do, what Hannah Arendt's talent is I can make people see what's happening and the danger in what's happening. But I can't tell them, I can say, here's what I think, but I can't tell them I'm right and they're wrong, because that's not true. I can only tell them, here's what I think, and I can show it to them. And I can ask them to think about what they're doing, because what they're doing, in my opinion, is ruining the world. And that's how I take it to be, that incredible Homeric impartiality where you can praise both Achilles and Hector, which she always talks about, is so important here. And so, she is somebody.
Roger, can I just, when you, if I may, if you speak of her Homeric impartiality, which may be the case, you can't then in the same thread say something as simplistic and as therefore incorrect in my view as she doesn't tell you what to think. I'm not saying she tells us what to think. Let's assume that you are right in describing her a Homeric impartiality, yes. But being a brilliant thinker, being a brilliant writer, being a brilliant filmmaker, whatever, you are not using language like the rest of us. Everything, call it coded if you like, everything refers to everything that's gone before it. And in discussing it, you have to pick through those threads, most of which perhaps are buried. And so that's my objection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, I think you're enlisting her in a crusade that's not her crusade. That's your crusade.
Which is, right?
Well, to resist consumerism. And I mean, again, I don't think she likes consumerism, but I don't think she thinks that
what about commodification? Is commodification consumerism here for the purposes?
Again, I don't think she likes it, but I don't think I think she doesn't see it as inhuman. She sees it as a change. And one of the things that Hannah Arendt is remarkable about, from my point of view, is her willingness to say things are going to change and things are going to get better and things are going to, she has, one of the things, she has no belief in progress, right? She doesn't believe that the world gets better. She also doesn't necessarily believe the world gets worse. She thinks it's changing all the time. And she has this incredible capacity to see the changes, obviously some of which she likes and some of which she doesn't like. But she sees her crusade is not to get people to argue for one change or another change or against one change or another change. Her crusade, whether it's your crusade or not, is to get people to think about it. That's her crusade. It's a consistent crusade throughout her life. And it's going to be completely unsatisfactory to a lot of people. And I'm not
But
trying.
excuse me, I'm sorry, just incidentally, it's not unsatisfactory to me. I mean, by the way, incidentally, to think about something. It's all we can do, yes?
Well, that's her point. And so you know, if that's the case, yeah, I mean, does she want rampant consumerism? No, but that's not her crusade. You never see Hannah Arendt out there fighting against consumerism. She talks about it as a symptom of what's happening to us, but it's not her thing. Her thing is we are doing it thoughtlessly. And if we're going to do it, we should be aware of what we're doing and how it's changing us and how it's going to impact.
People get that in their heads.
Okay. Liz.
Yeah, I was really struck by the way she was talking about the interest of one society as a whole as communistic fiction, and how that came up. And I guess it's a question and kind of thought about how we discuss here, in that I feel like it really struck me because it's such an obvious thing, but at the same time, oftentimes when we make our arguments, there's this implicit assumption that we're arguing it would be good for everyone, when that's nearly impossible. So is she arguing that people should be clear about who they're trying to advocate for, or who they think something would be better for in society, and being distinct and dividing that from others? Or is she saying that this idea of things being good for the whole of society has actually become truer and less fictitious as it's become more social?
Not 100% sure I caught all that, but let me ask you if I understood it. So when she talks about the communist fiction or the invisible hand, right? So she makes a connection between Smith's invisible hand and
yes,
and Marx. Clara, can you mute yourself if you're? I think you're on the phone or something.
Thank you very much for letting me know. I appreciate that. Yep. You too, and have a nice weekend. Bye.
She makes a distinction, a connection between the invisible hand of Smith and the communist fiction of Marx. Both are attempts to create a one idea, the idea that there's sort of a rational, best way to govern society, right? Okay, starting there, Liz, can you now tell me what your question is? Because I just didn't quite get it.
I guess the first part, so in saying it's a fiction, she's obviously disagreeing with it, and she's saying that there can be no one interest for all of society, right?
Yep.
So is something that she would advocate for, saying, defining exactly which part of society, I guess, is she arguing for a more combative kind of society where people are saying, this would be good for me and my people, and hashing it out? Or, because then I guess I got a little bit confused, because then on page 46, at the paragraph we talked about before with Dina, she says it's less of this oneness of mankind is not a fantasy really anymore. Or is that kind of an entirely different oneness that I'm confusing it with?
So the emergence of society has changed the estimate of this whole sphere, but has hardly transformed its nature. The monolithic character of every type of society, its conformism, which allows for only one interest and one opinion, is ultimately rooted in the oneness of mankind. It is because this oneness of mankind is not fantasy and not even merely a scientific hypothesis, as in the communistic fiction of classical economics, that mass society, where man as a social animal rules supreme and where apparently the survival of the species could be guaranteed on a worldwide scale, can at the same time threaten humanity with extinction. I take it, it's an interesting question. I think what she's saying, and I'm happy to be told I'm wrong on this, is that this oneness of mankind is not a fantasy. Once society has emerged as a monolithic character, and one opinion is rooted in the oneness of mankind. Let me just take a look at this paragraph. This constant growth, who's no less constant acceleration.
I read it a little differently, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, she does say it's in every type of society. So the oneness of mankind is essentially what society is all about.
Yeah.
So that conformism is inherent to society. Being a social animal is conforming.
No, that's exactly what I was saying. What the difference is that once that society becomes the dominant character of in the world, then it's not a fiction anymore. It becomes true for everyone because that's all that's left. I don't think she actually means that, because I don't think she thinks that society is so dominant that that's all that's left. That goes back to an earlier question, but she sometimes speaks that way.
It certainly threatens, because that she makes explicit. It threatens, but not necessarily, or so far at least hasn't succeeded.
Yeah, I think that's right. Liz, is that your question, or did we get it or not?
Kind of. I'm still kind of working through that in my brain a little bit. So, but I guess then the kind of first part of that question was then when we are hashing things out as people in a public space, since there isn't a oneness yet of society and a oneness of interests, does that mean we should be more specific about who in society things should benefit?
I think that's back to Vivian's question to some degree. I mean, Arendt does have an idea that politics is about the pursuit of interests, and different interests. And so the answer would be yes. But I don't think she's going to tell you which interest, but I mean, in general, yes, she's supports the pursuit of different multiple political interests. We got about a minute left, and I see there's 2 more questions. Maybe I'll just take both these questions. Can you keep them brief, Aldo and James? Walk up.
Thank you. I'll try to make it brief. I was a little confused by the reference to statistics in the text, and I didn't know if the point was sort of what you were saying earlier, that is that this kind of information can be used to guess about people's preferences and creative efficiencies and have all sorts of instrumental uses, or that it was that the mass quality of the, I don't know, behaviors or events that are being tackled is what's objectionable. I mean, I mean, it's a system for representing events and analyzing them, and the
Okay.
events may occur whether you represent them or not.
I can address that. Aldo, do you want to ask? Aldo, do you want to ask something too?
Yeah, thank you. It's about the Hannah Arendt definition of immortality. I mean, does she stands for it as the survival of a name and a narrative? What does she understand about this thing of immortality?
Okay. So on the statistics question, James, I think what I'd say is that the core threat of statistics is to meaningfulness and freedom in action. Insofar as we start to see people through the law of large numbers, we make it such that it's harder and harder to have an impact. Vivian was saying, well, you can still write a book and have an impact. Yes. You can still storm the Capitol and have an impact. Yes. But it becomes increasingly rare and difficult. And it's not even what most people want. Most people want to just enjoy. And, I think Vivian's right in that Arendt doesn't particularly like that vision of humanity. It's not hers. But my response is she's simply saying this is what's happening. I think maybe I'm being a little disingenuous because I think she's saying this is what's happening and she's asking us to think about it. She'd like us to think about it and act in such a way to change it, I think. And I think Vivian's right about that. But I don't think she thinks we can go back, and I don't think she thinks she has the answers. On the question of immortality, it's similar. I mean, what makes immortality possible are people who believe they can do and then do great deeds that then can be remembered and thus are meaningful. It comes back to this question of meaningfulness, and the loss of immortality and the rise of worldlessness is part and parcel of what she calls the loss of meaningfulness. So we're out of time, but we'll have we're just starting this book. We got a lot of time to get through it. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we will finish this section on the public, this first chapter on the public and private realm for next week. Thank you very much.